men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. One man, one microphone, one mission, one message. True News, the only newscast reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And now for the most powerful hour on radio, here is end-time newsman Rick Wiles.
This is True News, 1 hour of uncensored news, views, and commentary. Welcome to the program. I'm Rick Wiles. I posted on TrueNews.com today an exclusive news report from True News about a meeting held at the Vatican on Tuesday. Pope Francis met a delegation of evangelical Christian leaders, including Kenneth Copeland and James Robison. The full story is on our website, TrueNews.com. Today's program will focus on news about the condition of the global financial system that you will never see or hear on networks such as CNBC or read in newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal. That's because those news outlets have to censor the news. Jim Willie is on the telephone to tell us some of what he knows about things going on behind the scenes in the financial world. He is the editor and publisher of the Hat Trick Letter. Each month he publishes two massive reports, the Global Money War Report and the Golden Currency Report. I personally rely on those reports for information and insight about what's really happening in the financial world. And there's no way I can even summarize on this program what Jim loads into those two monthly reports. All I can say is that the newsletter is well worth the subscription price. And the website is goldenjackass.com. Jim Willie, let's start with Ukraine. Last week, Vladimir Putin voluntarily revoked powers granted to him by the Russian Duma to take military action in Ukraine. Furthermore, he withdrew soldiers from the border. Yesterday, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry gave Mr. Putin an ultimatum to give in to U.S. demands within hours or else. Today, Ukraine joined Georgia and Moldova in signing an agreement to begin the process of being brought into the European Union. My question to you, Jim, are Western leaders deliberately provoking a confrontation with Russia, or is this stuff nothing but a carefully choreographed, pre-scripted drama to deceive the world?
Very tough question. It's good to be back on, first to say. We've got a game going on where the U.S. and the West has only two cards to play against the Kremlin and Putin. One is to cut off and or steal gas from the Gazprom pipelines, cut it off and deny Europe its gas, or to steal and siphon, which is what they really do all the time in Ukraine. The second card they have is to do nuclear strikes. I don't mean like a worker strike, I mean like a nuclear attack. And we got a bunch of neocons that control a good deal of the U.S. military policy. And neocon is just a nice word for neo-Nazi. So people need to wake up that when Bush Jr. hit the office of the White House, and his gang of neocons came in with a lot of foreign passports, these were the Nazis. These were the neo-Nazis who brought us 9/11. I fully believe that they are key players behind the 9/11 attacks. So what's going on with Ukraine? I believe Putin set a trap in March, basically said, okay, we're going to pull our support in Kiev. If you're stupid enough to try to take it over, you can have it, because everybody will be watching you. They'll watch your thefts, they'll watch your murders, and they'll watch your mistreatment and imposition of a fascist rule. So Bulgaria is watching, Poland and Hungary are watching, Romania is watching. They're all watching. After a while, they're all going to get a very bitter taste and embrace Russia and the Eurasian trade zone. But in the meantime, Ukraine, I thought, would last 3 to 6 months before it sank into not exactly oblivion, but some deep quicksand, so that kind of a failed state. It's hard for the Ukraine system, for its finances, to really continue in a viable way when the U.S. went in there in late March and stole 33 tons of its gold. Now, that wasn't on the news. Well, why should it be? The people who control the news are the ones that did the thefts. 33 tons. Okay, that's almost $1 billion worth of hard asset core that the banking system could use. And not only that, but the U.S. and its EU partners, the bankers, saw fit to remove $70 billion of government money and family money from the former president and other unpopular oligarchs. And where's all that $70 billion going? It went and got parked in the Swiss banks. That money's never coming back, and the gold is never coming back. And the IMF rescues are not going to go where you think they go. So in the most recent move, to get to your direct question, what's Putin doing, stating that he's withdrawing his right for military action? Let me just back up a second. The Western press likes to say Russia took over Crimea. No, they didn't. They're sitting there, and they ran a referendum that ended up 93 or 94 or 95% in favor of adopting Russian rule and joining the Russian Federation. That's a far cry from what the Western press is saying. They did not go in and attack Crimea. The United States and the NATO forces used Langley mercenaries and Soros mercenaries and organized a coup d'etat in Kiev, stole the money, and started pressuring Gazprom for, the old sweet price reductions on the already sweet price reduction they got. So now Putin is saying we're going to withdraw our military right, I think for two reasons. First, he sees that the economy has gone to hell. I mean, they didn't even plant. Just for a second, people need to understand, Ukraine has the best farmland in all of Eastern Europe. It's like Iowa. They didn't plant anything. So how's their economy going to look this summer and harvest time? Putin probably had a pretty good idea. It's going to look lousy. Okay, the second reason Putin withdrew from his military actions, which, they could be aggressive and active, or they could be reactive and kind of defensive. The second reason, I believe, is that he's working with Germany and Austria to complete the South Stream pipeline. Now, Americans don't get much in the news about the pipeline story. They get, a dribble here and there. They're not given very good news. It's pathetic. But about 10 years ago, Russia and Gazprom decided we need some alternatives because everything was going through Ukraine in pipeline networks. And, it worked out great for a while, except they realized, these pipes are getting old and the Ukrainians are stealing gas. They're just siphoning it off and putting it in huge silos. I mean, you can't do that with Russia and have things continue. So they built a Nord Stream, N-O-R-D, Nord Stream, that's just north, and that went into the Baltic Sea and, just below the Arctic, and went into northern German ports. And there are a lot of LNG, liquefied natural gas port facilities. That's all completed and has been operating for some time. I don't have the exact number of years, but I believe it's been now about a couple of years. The other strategy was to go south of Ukraine, called South Stream. Goes through Serbia and Hungary and Austria. So notice what's happened in the last couple of weeks. The Bulgarian government wants the EU economic benefits. So they're pursuing the EU and not necessarily the NATO, which is the military commitment. So they're pursuing the commercial and economic benefits in the EU. And they gave lip service to Kerry and John McCain and the other clowns from the U.S. Senate who went to Bulgaria they told them, oh, no, we'll block the South Stream. Well, as soon as they were gone, they shook hands with the Gazprom folks and Putin's representatives, I think that Lavrov, the foreign minister, and they said, no, we've got full commitment. This is necessary for our commercial development and our economy. So they're playing the U.S. for the EU side. They're playing the U.S. government to obtain the EU approval for commercial and economic benefit. They're playing Gazprom in the Kremlin with Putin's representatives for, again, commercial and economic benefit. I think Putin realizes the Ukraine economy is going to collapse. So no need to fight in there anymore. Just let it sink. And that was my forecast in March and April. It's got about 6 months, and the whole economy is going to fail.
Jim, the business that you and I are both in, you have sources. From time to time, I get calls from people that are trustworthy, knowledgeable, deeply connected, and they've been given information. Sometimes, I have to wonder, okay, was that information deliberately given to that person to get to me so I'd put it on the radio? But, that's a whole other discussion about where the source of that information. But in late May, I was called by a gentleman that I know personally, a businessman, very successful businessman, a lot of connections. He had been told that, again, this is May, he said there will be a short-lived war between Russia and Ukraine that will break out around mid-July. And shortly after that, gold prices will begin to skyrocket. Are you hearing anything about this, that there is going to be some type of military confrontation in July?
I don't understand the question.
It's not really a question. I guess what I'm asking you is have you heard any rumors that there is planned a Russian incursion into Ukraine in the middle of July?
There's already Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. I don't understand the question.
Well, an all-out war. An all-out war in between Russia and Ukraine, literally an invasion.
I'm sorry. There's already a war. There's already an all-out war.
Well, it's Spetsnaz. It's Spetsnaz and commandos, and but I'm talking about where tens of thousands of troops are brought in, and
there are already 10,000 troops in. They're blowing up bridges. They're damming off waterways to deny Crimea water. They're attacking checkpoint posts on the border. They got raids. I heard there was a gigantic armory raid where the loyal troops to the Kiev regime lost a couple hundred tanks, dozens and dozens of armored carriers, Stinger missiles, all kinds of equipment, 200, 300, 400 pieces of military hardware that weigh tonnage. There's already a war. I thought your question was going to be, is you think it'll break out into a nuclear war in July? Because there's already a war.
All right, let's go.
Question.
Okay, let's go to the next question. Is this war going to eventually erupt into a nuclear confrontation?
Only if the United States wants to commit suicide.
And what's your guess? What do you think they're going to do?
I think they're going to get booted from power. We got some very strange things that are happening that are not in Ukraine that will relate to Ukraine. And it's happening in Syria.
Okay.
It has to do with the ISIS. It's that, broad
ISIS, right.
Syria, Iraq, Sunni. They want to create a Sunni religious caliphate.
Mm-hmm.
And the troops that are working there are Langley troops. They're trained, funded, and armed by Langley. They first attacked last autumn in Syria. And now that they've gotten a stalemate with some Russian support in Damascus and Syria, the whole horde of maybe 10 to 12,000 very vicious and nasty, well-trained and well-armed troops are moving into Iraq, rather. They're going down Syria toward the Syrian-Iraq border, and they're slaughtering dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, in the Iraqi regular military, which is not very well equipped or trained. they're stripping off their uniforms and running before they're captured and killed. So here's the relation of the two. What I'm hearing is the U.S. military, let's call them the Pentagon regulars. You got to be careful when you talk about U.S. military anymore. What kind of U.S. military are you talking about? Is this the Pentagon U.S. Army, what I call the Pentagon regulars, with U.S. Air Force backup? Or is it the Langley military, which has unmarked uniforms and tens of thousands of mercenaries funded by narcotics money? All right, so there are two militaries in the United States. One is Pentagon regulars, and the other one is Langley mercenaries. They're about to encounter each other in Iraq. The U.S. military Pentagon regulars evacuated Iraq, and what filled the vacuum was the Langley mercenaries trained for Syria that migrated south and announced their new agenda. So they're breaking away a little bit from Langley, but they're still Langley funded and Langley trained and Langley armed, and now they've decided that they want to get some independent funding. So they stole the Mosul, I think it was $400 million, $420 million, Mosul, Iraq Bank, the central bank. You know, the U.S. has Federal Reserve banks in, 12 different cities, Philadelphia, Dallas, San Francisco, Chicago, that we call like the Dallas Fed, the San Francisco Fed. Well, the Mosul Fed for the Iraqi central bank got robbed. And on their way to rob the bank, they also jumped a military base and stole all the equipment. We're talking about tanks, armored carriers, 1 million rounds of handheld missile types. So now the ISIS group is developing its own independent arming and independent munitions and independent funding. I wonder if maybe they're working with Langley or partially against Langley or both. Now, here's what I'm hearing. When and if and when the Pentagon regulars in Iraq encounter the Langley mercenaries, Obama's going to get a house call because U.S. military will be fighting U.S. military. Pentagon versus Langley. Tax money military versus narco money military. And what I'm hearing is the rap on the door at the White House will be senators with an impeachment proceeding that might gather a lot more force after the Democrats lose the full Congress in November. So that's how it relates to Ukraine. And, this is not finance stuff. So I had to answer the question because it's so important. And, we've got a whole lot of other very interesting, intriguing things going on, like I believe China purchasing the Federal Reserve and buying J.P. Morgan's headquarters and flying the Chinese flag alongside the U.S. flag in Dallas until the U.S. citizens objected. So they removed the Chinese flag. Why was the Chinese flag flying on a Federal Reserve property? I think because they own the Federal Reserve. What's going on?
The Chinese flag was flying at the Federal Reserve on Pearl Street in downtown Dallas?
That's correct, until it was taken down after objections. Flying side by side with the U.S. flag. We're focusing on Ukraine and Iraq, I think, too much, because we're cratering and we're imploding in the United States. I could read you a list of 25 retail chains that are all imploding in the United States. Macy's, Darden's, Staples, Target. I could name the whole list. So why are we only focusing on Ukraine and whether there might be a war, there might be a war, there might be a nuclear war? Where was the war with Iran? In 05, 06, 07, 08, 09, 10, 11, and 12.
Well, Iran's now our ally.
Exactly. So why were the morons focusing on an Iran war? I lost 2 friends over the stupidity of expecting a nuclear war with Iran in 09, 10, 11, and 12.
Mm-hmm.
I said, no, cooler heads will prevail. Commerce will prevail. And when it comes to Eastern Europe, commerce will prevail. I've been told that Germany just gave Austria an assignment, Rick. The assignment is to complete the South Stream, continue to give whatever necessary lip service to the moron, John Kerry, Secretary of State, and the idiots in the Senate who like to go around from Eastern European state to state, pressuring them with EU olives and promises of military protection that will destroy their economy.
Jim, you mentioned the possibility of impeachment. Again, this is another rumor that in recent days that we're tracking down. Entertainer Pat Boone made a very interesting cryptic remark on the Alan Combs radio program days ago. He said he knew for certain that information about Barack Obama's identity would be brought forth before September. Then another person told me that the boys, the big boys, are going to sacrifice Barack Obama as a diversion. That they're going to allow a lot of stuff to come out about him this fall to divert the attention of the American people from what they are doing to the American economy and the sellout of the country and the dismantlement of the country. Are you hearing anything along those lines?
I heard stuff along those lines for the last 2 years about Obama's identity. No one seems to want to pursue his Kenyan birth. No one seems to want to pursue his lack of Columbia University activity as a student.
Well, Sheriff Joe Arpaio just said publicly that he's very close to announcing the name of the birth certificate forger.
Well, that's all fine, but do you think anybody in the Attorney General's office will give a damn, or the Congress? You think it'll actually make the news, the network news? I don't. I think that's a grand yawn. I mean, one of the funniest things I found of all the false identity of Obama, which is a huge story all in itself, who are his parents? His parents both worked at Langley. People, you need to wake up. Okay, the funniest thing I know about Obama is that he claimed to be on the Columbia University Law Review. Well, I've got a couple friends who went to law school, and they were on law review. Well, guess what? When you're on law review, you have publications. It's part of the deal. You're the cream of the crop in the law school class, and your assignment is remain on the law review by publishing something. My brother published stuff on the Sherman Antitrust Act at University of North Carolina Law School. When I asked him, where's the Columbia Law Review publications for Barry, that's what I call Obama, he says, I'm sure it's all there. Yeah, well, right. Well, where is it? It doesn't exist. So if you want to talk about his identity, fine. But how about instead talking about the narcotics addiction for Clinton, W. Bush, and Obama, none of whom released medical records to the Congress, which is a requirement of the presidency. I mean, I don't care about his background. Gosh, he's got 2 Social Security cards, one from the state of Connecticut. This is what CIA agents do.
Well, that in itself is the scandal. If he is...
Rick, pick which one of the 20 is important. I think the most important one that's going to get some traction is Benghazi and the Libyan embassy. We have Navy SEALs who were killed. We have an ambassador, I think his name was Stevens.
Chris Stevens.
Who was burned to death, alive.
That's right. And we've been on this since the day it happened. I was told the very next day, September 12, 2012, a friend called me. He had just came from a breakfast meeting with a wealthy businessman that I personally know, and that man was a friend of Chris Stevens. And he said Chris was murdered. They allowed him to die. And my friend asked this businessman why, and he said Chris knew too much about what was going on. This was the very next day after the Benghazi debacle. And so I've been stating on the air day after day, this was a gun-running operation. They were arming Al-Qaeda. They cannot afford for the truth to come out about this story.
Right, exactly. I agree. The arming of Al-Qaeda for the troops, the mercenaries that were working in Damascus, in Syria, and previously in Egypt, which was a failed operation. Stevens knew too much. He was at risk of going public. I don't think he liked what was going on. I mean, if he were the ambassador and didn't like what was going on, why didn't he resign before he got burned to death? I mean, there's so much going on behind the scenes. You could come up with, apart from identity issues, you can come up with 5 or 6 very serious impeachable offenses, like the gun running with the Mexican cartels.
Oh, by the way, today, I don't know if you know this, Jim, but today a Mexican helicopter, military helicopter, came across the U.S. border and fired shots at U.S. Border Patrol agents in Arizona. I mean, this is starting to get real crazy what's happening. Hey, I want to ask you about Germany and their new trust in the Federal Reserve. They said they don't want the gold repatriated now. They trust the Federal Reserve and no need to ship the gold back. What do you think's happening in that story?
It's kind of like Putin withdrawing his military right in Ukraine. Germany is realizing the battle to be fought with the New York Fed over the theft of their gold, and it's not, thousands of tons. It was 300 tons. And they promised to return, I think, something like 40 or 50 per year for 7 years. It was exactly the amount of gold output from Chad after they decided Chad had spotted some Islamic terrorists in Chad. Okay, right. So Germany has decided, I believe, and from what I'm told, that there are better battles to fight. And, let the New York Fed play its games on the gold front by not returning and repatriating the gold, because Germany's got 2 things going on in its agenda. The first is, as I said before, the assignment given to Austria to complete the South Stream pipeline south of Ukraine for Gazprom. Now, when that happens, it means that Eastern Europe will be provided in its southern portion, but then also Austria and Germany will receive new pipeline input. That's very important. We're talking about the middle of next year, 2015. So Germany is told, I believe, the New York banker criminals, let's drop the whole thing, because they've got a better gold play. They're going to back Russia and China with their gold-backed, they're going to support Russia and China with their gold-backed new currencies, the gold-backed yuan from China, the gold-backed ruble from Russia, which is going to be the basis of trade settlement for the giant Eurasian trade zone that Eastern Europe and parts of Western Europe are going to beg to be part of, so they're not stuck in the third world with the United States. So I think they've got a better gold card to play, Rick, and that has to do with the BRICS and their central bank that's coming into shape, which I believe has given us hints of its gold sourcing for the BRICS central bank. It's the bulge of almost $400 billion in treasury bonds sitting in the Belgium central bank account. Now, I think that's an accounting shenanigan, because it's really Euroclear, which is kind of a depot, a warehouse. It resides in Brussels. And I think the BRICS, meaning Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are pitching in lots and lots of treasury bonds and doing a sourcing through futures contracts, adding to their margin on margin calls because of the drop in gold price, adding to their positions when additional treasury bonds are released, say, from India, Russia, China, the big 3. Germany's going to back all this. They've already pivoted east. They're allowing their politicians and their bankers to play the EU and NATO game. 3,000 German companies currently do business in Russia. Do you think Germany's going to sign on for the sanctions?
All right, Jim, one thing that I want to know from you, what's the real story behind J.P. Morgan selling their headquarters in New York City that had the underground vault, the biggest commercial vault in the world, and linked by a tunnel to the New York Federal Reserve? What's the real story?
It's a complicated sequence, but I think I pieced it together with the help of a crack staff plus The Voice, who's an international gold trader. You got to look back to the most favored nation status given to China. I wondered for the longest time, why on earth would the U.S. corporations want to go full bore with foreign direct investment into China and abandon on a greater basis than they've already done in the United States, 48 states? We already had the 20 years, the 20 years from 1980 to 2000 of outsourcing to the Pacific Rim and more. So here's what I have come to learn. The Voice confirmed to me that the most favored nation status had a back end of it of a lease by Wall Street of at least 1,000, probably more like about 2,000 tons of gold, Chinese Mao Zedong era gold. And what I've come to piece together with the help of Rob Kirby and Euro Raj, who's a London banker, a brilliant fellow. Rob Kirby's brilliant. They're both brilliant. But the Voice didn't pitch in too much on this except to say, way to go, you figured it out. But he confirmed after we came up with it, here's what happened. The Chinese didn't want to lease their gold to the United States, so they said, put up some collateral. So the United States Wall Street put up One Chase Plaza, the headquarters for J.P. Morgan, which included a conference center. That's something like 5 or 7 stories with office action, too. But they also had the 10-story underground, nuclear bomb-proof, largest commercial gold vault in the world, the J.P. Morgan Vault, which has underground tunnels to the Federal Reserve New York Fed vaults. So when they jockey around their gold, it goes from the Fed, New York Fed, straight into the J.P. Morgan, back and forth, overnight, whatever. So then the Chinese, this is what we are concluding, because why else would they force the sale of One Chase Plaza for a minuscule $1.7 or $1.9 billion when the 75-story building alone is worth $3 or $4 billion? All right, here's what we've come to conclude. In order to secure the gold lease, China didn't trust Wall Street. They wanted to secure it with collateral. Hey, look, the building alone is not sufficient. The J.P. Morgan headquarters are not sufficient. They wanted something up front from the U.S. government. So the government created a derivative, a financial derivative off the IRS income stream. And it acts much like a mortgage does with secure stream, which you securitize. Well, they securitized the IRS income stream. Now, a funny thing happened on the way to the forum after 2008. The U.S. economy and its banking system died. The U.S. economy has been dragging its butt, not doing well. The U.S. banking system has been insolvent, which they rescued with 2009, April 1st, FASB accounting rules jockeying. They changed everything, so now Wall Street can declare that they're not insolvent just by word rather than proof through independent accounting. So they reneged on the gold lease return, and they defaulted on the IRS secure stream derivative. So J.P. Morgan lost its headquarters, and the United States government lost its sovereignty. That's what's going on.
Jim, if you put the sale of the J.P. Morgan headquarters together with the Chinese flags reportedly flying at the Federal Reserve branch on Dallas Street on Pearl Street in Dallas, it sounds to me that we may be looking at a Chinese foreclosure of the U.S. Federal Reserve.
And the entire U.S. economy, yes. They now own the future income from the Federal Reserve and the income taxes from the IRS. They own the IRS income stream. I believe it's been transferred from the Vatican to China, in the last year. Now we're going to get more industrial parks with Chinese labels and Chinese workers, and eventually you're going to get outposts and plants bought up by the Chinese with open season for hiring skilled Americans.
I have warned for years that I've been very concerned that U.S. officials were pledging American Social Security numbers as collateral for Chinese loans.
Well, that's too late. We lost that. That went insolvent a year or two ago. They pledged the IRS much richer stream. The Chinese aren't stupid. They probably turned down the Social Security stream. They went straight to the IRS, which I believe, I'm not sure of exact numbers, but I believe it's something like $500 or $600 billion a year.
Now, when I say Social Security numbers, I'm talking about that they pledged the American people, literally our labor. They pledged us as collateral. Well,
through our Social Security contributions and IRS withholdings, yes.
Mm-hmm.
We're about to be colonized. They own 30%. The Chinese own 30% of Manhattan commercial property. They own a significant percent of Vancouver property and Los Angeles commercial property. They're moving in. They're redeeming their treasury bonds. But in the meantime, they're going to interrupt and force the United States to launch another U.S. dollar domestic currency. I'm calling it the Scheisse dollar. It's going to be for U.S. purposes only. It'll be devaluated 30% right out of the gate, which will cause 50% import price inflation immediately.
All right, I'm going to, if you can explain this in a short period of time, you're talking about a two-tier dollar system, a dollar for international trades, a domestic dollar for the American people. How does that work?
Well, the first step is you lose the Federal Reserve control of the dollar, and I believe that's already happened. The Chinese control the Federal Reserve. They're going to maybe change the charter of the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and get it to work jointly with, say, the Federal Reserve New York office. That way they'll have a European center outpost for the Federal Reserve, IMF office. They might even change the IMF office to Federal Reserve European office. No, that's the beginning. It's going to be called the international dollar, and it's going to be loaded with conspiracy and intrigue and all kinds of messy stuff. Like what happens in Panama, Switzerland, Singapore, and Hong Kong with all the dollar accounts? Are they intact? When you have a new launch Scheisse dollar, they're trying to call it the Treasury note instead of the Federal Reserve note. The U.S. Treasury note will be the basis of the new dollar. I'm hearing it called the Republic dollar. It's nice to call it a republic. Well, what is it, the fascist Republic of America? No, we're likely to see a split dollar because of QE and the unsterilized bond monetization that is wrecking the global economy. The rest of the world wants to take away the dollar from the United States, and when it does so, the U.S. will need to create its own dollar and then wreck it.
Are they going to resurrect the Amero concept?
I don't think so. Canada is way too much in Chinese control already. Western Canada is already a Chinese colony with all kinds of guaranteed supply routes for Athabasca oil and Western Canada agricultural output. Remember, their summers are longer than U.S. summers. So they have a longer growing season there for the midsummer. They got, I shouldn't say that, not a longer season, longer daylight. In Saskatchewan, the sun sets at 10 p.m. In Edmonton, Alberta, it sets at 10:30 p.m. in June.
All
so
right.
we have that now. So China already has colonized British Columbia. They own the main Vancouver port and the Port Richey port. Those are major ports where mining ore goes out, dory bar. I mean, just all kinds of output from agriculture, cement, coal, whatever, all kinds of. They're not going to let the United States save itself by attaching a millstone around Mexico and Canada's neck.
By the way, the BRICS summit is coming up in about 2 or 3 weeks. Do you expect that we will see and hear a major announcement about an alternative financial system coming out of the summit?
I think we're going to get some announcements. I don't think we're going to get the full table. I think they have a great challenge that actually started about 3 years ago to get all the connections working. When you have a gold-backed currency, it's not simple. You need to have a connection between the Forex currency market and, say, the crude oil market and the gold market. And just throw in silver, too. And let's leave out natural gas, because that's very localized, as we're finding out. For a long time, Europe and the United States had a markedly different natural gas price. The gap between Brent crude oil and U.S.-based West Texas crude oil, that gap was, $10, $20 for a few years. That's completely closed. And the hint behind the closing of the Brent Texas oil price gap means the petrodollar is dead. So Saudi support for the petrodollar is gone.
All right, that was my next question. Where are the Saudis in this mix right now?
2 weeks ago, they announced an independent sovereign fund, sovereign wealth fund, independent of the Saudi central bank. And its main responsibilities would be to find good investments, safe investments, secure investments that move away from sovereign bonds. Can you say conversion of treasury bonds to gold bullion? Now, this Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, SWF, the Saudi fund is independent of their central bank. Now, here's the importance of the Saudi Sovereign Fund now that's coming into play. I believe if they start learning how to convert treasury bonds and other sovereign bonds, like Euro bonds, like UK gilts, the British and European sovereign bonds that support the pound sterling and the euro currency. If the Saudis begin to get competence and experience and get the channels working to convert treasury bonds and other sovereign bonds to gold, expect all the Persian Gulf nations to follow in that path and maybe use the same offices. And bear in mind the marriage that's taken place in the last 2 months, 3 months, between the Saudis and the Chinese. I can't even count the number of summit meetings they've had. I'm up to about 4 or 5, and I think I've missed a couple. They have these love fests that I call. It's a meeting between the finance ministers, various economics ministers, cultural exchange organizations, charity groups, petrochemical business investors, private investors, sovereign wealth fund, SAFE out of China. And it's just a giant conference where I think the Saudis were given some marching orders. Set up, I mean, I can't prove this, I'm just guessing, but the Saudis are working closely with China and have been for 3 months. The first thing they did when they came back from one of these summits back in, I think, April, was to have a parade to show all kinds, in the parade, in the big avenues, to show all kinds of Chinese missiles. They showed off Chinese military hardware. That's a giant flipped bird to the U.S. military and the U.S. government. Okay, the other thing they did was they started inviting for what I call détente, and you hear the word rapprochement in French, between the Saudis and the Iranians. And now you've got a meeting with the the Kuwaitis and certain Iran ministers. And now you've got meetings between the Qataris and Russian Gazprom leaders, executives. You're having a love fest between the whole Persian Gulf and Russia and China. But the most important element that I see, apart from the Saudis setting up a sovereign wealth fund, which I believe is to be to convert treasury bonds to gold. The most important thing I see is a warming of relations between Riyadh and Tehran, between the Saudis and Iran. The United States doesn't like this. The United States is all about war, destruction, undermined economy, bond fraud, stolen gold. Shall I go on?
Jim, will the Nazi neocons turn their ISIS army onto the Saudis?
They already have.
Debka File reported today that the Saudi military is on high alert.
They're on massive overdrive for desertion.
Plus, what about a month or two ago, the Saudis asked Pakistan for, what was it, like 100,000 troops to be stationed in Saudi Arabia?
The Iraqis don't know how to defend their country. The U.S. went in there not to do nation building, but to gather in all the oil that they could, lock in contracts, and to bring about rescinded Russian and Chinese contracts. And while they were at it, they stole the Iraqi central bank gold. This is the common theme. They stole Gaddafi's gold in Libya. They tried to steal Egyptian gold. They failed.
Jim, for a year or two over the radio, I kept saying to Muammar Gaddafi, if you're listening, Colonel, pack up your gold and run. They're going to steal your gold, and they're going to kill you. And that's exactly what they did. They stole his gold and they killed Gaddafi. So the question is, if the Saudis are playing footsie with the Chinese right now and getting ready to drop the U.S. petrodollar, will the neocon Nazis turn the ISIS jihadists onto Saudi Arabia to bring down the Saudi royal family?
I think they're going to try. One of the things making the Saudi royals extremely nervous right now is that a large contingent of ISIS, just think of it as the Arab fanatic mercenaries that fought in Syria and are now moving south into Iraq. The majority, a good solid contingency of these Arab fanatic guerrillas are Saudis. So in a sense, Saudi is trying to fund them to keep them busy outside their borders. They don't want them to come home. The United States did something already to Saudis, and it angered them to no end. They released a deadly virus. This is what we do.
You're talking about the MERS?
Yes. And that, I think, took the Saudi royals over the edge, and they decided, we're going to accelerate our embracing of the East and our embracing of the petro-yuan, the settlement of energy sales in yuan. We're going to accelerate it, and really very closely timed after the MERS release from the U.S. Army Bioweapons Lab of Fort Detrick. Wake up, Americans. We're the virus source. We developed SARS, targeting China. We developed HIV, targeting Africa. They came up with all kinds of BS stories about its origin in Sierra Leone with monkeys. Oh, my gosh. Crazy, crazy stuff.
And right now, at the University of Wisconsin, we have scientists that are recreating the 1918 Spanish flu virus.
Well, that's what the swine flu vaccine was. I have a friend, a gal in Costa Rica here, and in late in 08, all the teachers were telling the students you had to take the swine flu vaccine. It's straight from the United States. It's perfectly safe. It'll keep you healthy. And they came up with a phony story that the president of Costa Rica, Arias, developed a case of swine flu and took treatment for it and was better in 2 weeks. It was a total lie. I told my gal to tell all of her aunts to refuse, because it was optional. Refuse. All 13 are just fine. The one who took it, that little girl, 11 years old, took the swine flu vaccine. And for 2 years now, she's had what they call, in their own words, a mysterious brain disease. And I said, tell them to tell their doctor to look up Barré-Goulaine syndrome, because that's what's laced in with the U.S. version of the swine flu vaccine developed with the help of Novartis and the U.S. military that's got the Alaskan storage of all kinds of victims frozen who died from the Spanish flu outbreak in 1915. We're making viruses, and we're delivering them with vaccines.
Jim, I've got about 4 or 5 minutes remaining. I'm going to try to squeeze in a couple more questions. End of Money author Jim Rickards has been stating in recent weeks in numerous interviews, you can tell this is a line he's repeating over and over and over, that things are happening faster than he previously expected, and now he suspects we could see major economic events unraveling in 2014. Are things going faster? Are they unraveling quicker?
Well, yeah, I give Jim Rickards an A+ for hind vision. We've had a degradation of the U.S. economy for the last 18 to 20 months as we went into QE2, Operation Twist, QE3, the fake taper talk, the rescinded taper talk, QE to infinity. This is called, Mr. Rickards, if you're listening, this is called capital destruction from unsterilized bond monetization. I give you an A+ for hind vision. No, this is old news. The U.S. economy is unraveling. Look at the Q1. He's expecting that 2014 is going to look awful. Well, yeah, of course it is. We got a revision of minus 2.9% for the first quarter on the GDP.
Hey, and the stock market went up that day when the numbers came out that the U.S. economy had contracted by almost 3%. The market went up. Imagine how high it would have gone up if the economy would have contracted 5 or 6%.
I'm sorry to say it, but those who follow the stock market and the COMEX gold market have IQs under 90. I don't look at the stock market. I couldn't tell you if it's 15,000, 12,000.
I'm making a joke. The fact that on the day that the numbers came out showing how bad the U.S. economy was, the stock prices went up. And I was like, this is insane. I mean, this is crazy.
I don't care.
I know. It's all manipulated. I mean, everything is fake at this point. Nothing is real. Simon Black posted a story today from Singapore where a high-level, I don't have the article in front of me. I don't know if it's a central banker or wealthy billionaire, stated that there is a calm before the storm, and he told Malaysian investors to prepare for a banking collapse.
Well, that sounds all very good, but calm? We've had no calm for 3 years. I'd like to point out something that maybe is not on your radar, this BNP Paribas criminal investigation by the Attorney General's Office, Department of Justice, U.S. government. We're starting to see the evidence of massive Treasury bond dumping. Now, it's hard to connect the two unless you really have a good experience level of Treasury bonds, but I believe BNP Paribas has been helping Russia and China and India to dump their Treasury bonds, and the U.S. government found out about it. So how do they dump Treasury bonds but develop a huge short position on Treasuries that the U.S. government noticed? So in come the Attorney General clowns and try to impose a $10 billion fine, which is way out of whack, and impose an admission of guilt document, which will force them to be liquidated. And I think they're going to try to fold them into Societe Generale, the big French bank, because that's where they've got better control room activity for the Treasury bond, exchange stabilization fund, and the gold futures contracts. So the BNP Paribas case is an example of one.